Hey folks, Jay from Cold Nights here, and a lot of YouTubers have been making videos recently about scarcity and value of games and the video game market, specifically the secondhand market. I wanted to make a video discussing the factors that I believe lead into games being valuable or not. So let's take a deep dive into supply, demand, and the factors that affect them both. Let's get into it. Also, because some people can get a little intense when talking about the secondhand collecting market, we're going to set this discussion to beautiful nature documentary footage shot by my good friend Miss Mandia and beautiful, soothing background music made by my good friend Kaivoks. Thanks, guys. Supply and demand have been the basic building blocks of our economy since the beginning of time. Whether it was cavemen trading food for work, travelers trading spice for linens, or the New York Stock Exchange, it has always been the way. Every field has different things that factor into supply and demand. Video games are by no means different. Let's take a look first at factors I believe are integral to the supply side of the game collecting economy. 1. Scarcity. One of the biggest factors in supply is simply the amount of product that is out there. No matter how much of a bull rush happens with a certain item, it will always in the end rise and fall with the available quantity on the market. We saw great examples of this with sports card collecting in the junk wax era pre-2000. Tons of people had invested huge amounts of money in sports cards of their favorite players. Rookie cards from the 70s and 80s. Rare insert cards. One day, around the turn of the century, all of these collectors woke up to find their cards had literally become worthless. The industry had been taken over by memorabilia, autographed, and super rare individually numbered parallel variants. The quantities on these could be easily verified and they were quite low. The card values no longer centered on solely demand. Supply had re-emerged as the primary factor. What was more valuable? A Ken Griffey Jr. rookie card, or an individually numbered to 10 hand-signed card from Ken Griffey that was incredibly hard to pull from individual packs. Video games are much the same. A lot of people wonder why most Atari and ColecoVision games aren't very valuable. Simply look up E.T. Atari Landfill on YouTube and you have your answer. Most of the games were produced in massive quantities to keep up with the video game boom. When the market crashed, the demand for them went down and to this day hasn't really returned. Massive amounts of game, little to no demand, no value. The same goes for quite a lot of NES games. Simply too much supply, far surpassing even the nostalgia many of us have for those cards that's driving demand. External factors can also greatly affect supply. Things like rule of rose, with bans in many countries across the world. Things like some licensed sports and racing games that got pulled off store shelves quickly after being released due to licensing or copyright issues. Another huge factor can be who the initial consumer for the games were. Popular franchises that are banking on the nostalgia in the retro market, like Pokemon, were owned primarily by children when they were first released. Most kids simply don't take care of their games. They don't keep the boxes or manuals in good shape, or at all. Every kid that ripped through the Pokemon Yellow box at Christmas time next to the tree was having a blast, I'm sure. But when they threw that torn apart box in the trash, quite a bit of the value went along with it. Kids often destroy, improperly handle, or lose games as well. And don't get me started on giving a kid one of your disc-based games to play. Ooh. So, when I see folks pondering why Pokemon games are so valuable even though they were produced in massive quantities, I always point out that they were also lost, damaged, and abused in massive quantities as well, especially compared to games more adults might have played in different genres, like horror or puzzle games. Another factor to consider is even if these games were produced in larger amounts than physical games may be produced today, genre staples and favorites like Resident Evil 2, for example, get bought up and go into people's collections. Most horror or even mainstream collectors consider that game a must-have, and when they get a decent condition, complete copy, they are not selling or trading it for other games. So, though Resident Evil 2 was released across many platforms and in huge numbers, Many of them are off the market and will not re-enter the market until some of these collectors die and they go through estate sales or get willed to someone who will sell them. Another huge factor is the small things that can determine the quantity that a company produces for a console, especially if that console is less popular or at the end of its life. Things like Resident Evil 2 on the N64 or GameCube, Silent Hill Shattered Memories on PS2, or something like Breath of the Wild on Wii U. These games were released at the tail end of a console's life, or on consoles that were not popular or served the target demographic of the games. Why else would nearly every horror RPG title on the Wii have significant value on the secondary market? Because they don't appeal to casual gamers who made up the majority of that console's base. There was still enough demand for a physical release, but only in limited quantities. As someone who has worked as a retail manager for many years, I am acutely aware of the price of carrying and storing goods. People don't realize that for companies like Nintendo, there is absolutely only cost and loss in holding on to games they cannot ship to retailers. Even retailers themselves incur massive costs storing unsold goods in their warehouses and back rooms. Even on the shelves, as an item that is not selling or moving is literally taking up square footage in the store that something that could sell and drive profits could be occupying. Before we move on to demand, I want to address the claims of artificial scarcity that every YouTuber is talking about. There is either no such thing as artificial scarcity, or everything is artificially scarce, depending on how you want to look at it. No matter what genre of game, no matter what console it releases on, there is a conscious, informed decision made by men and women who know much more about business and numbers than any of us sitting at a computer making YouTube videos do. Based on trends, past sales, series performance, demand for the genre and chosen console. All of those things go into it. Even further, many games will sell perfectly fine with a digital-only release, while some genres like horror JRPGs have fans who prefer physical copies. When the company makes that call to produce X amount and sell it at X price, is that not artificial scarcity always? They will produce many more copies of a Call of Duty Black Ops game than they will a niche JRPG like Harvestella. That isn't some grand plot to control the game collecting market, it's business. It's a sound decision. No matter how many of us may like the Trails series or the Saga series, if they release them in the same quantity they do, say, Madden or MLB The Show, our beloved JRPG companies would quickly be bankrupted, and stores would be sitting on massive amounts of merchandise they simply can't sell. Many companies like Falcom, NIS, Exceed, and Koei Tecmo have built their brand on releasing premium titles for niche markets in small quantities. They can make a fair amount, especially off their collectors and special editions, but even their basic physicals, and offer the game to anyone that may have missed that window of availability digitally. They aren't evil, there is no scheme here, it's sound business logic. Even limited run publishers aren't necessarily evil. My concern with many of them is the excessive wait time after pre-orders, and the fact that some of those games have either been indefinitely delayed, never end up being released, or were released on other platforms or by other companies and had superior versions of the game physically on the cart or disc. I find long waits and long pre-order windows as a way to put the cart before the pony for many of these companies, allowing them to build capital while being able to delay coming through with the product for long periods of time. Even this isn't necessarily evil, it's more just inconvenient for consumers. The fact that the companies aren't transparent about this is also kind of an issue. But I digress. Limited publishers are another can of worms and another video entirely. To the folks up in arms about artificial scarcity, I say this. Initial publishers have zero stake in the secondary market. It simply isn't their business. Most games will get 1 or 2 print runs and be done. They will be offered digitally after that. I hear so many people saying, why can't they just reprint more? I see so many reprints or found stock sales go crazy fast on VGP. They're throwing away money. No, they're not. Just because 100 people dove at the Grandia Remaster Collection on VGP when they stealth dropped it on a Tuesday afternoon, doesn't mean 100,000 people or 1 million people would be willing to buy that game physically at GameStop, Target, or Walmart. As much as we all love VGP and our niche titles, that is a difficult but truth-laden pill to swallow. Grandia is not Call of Duty, no matter how much you like it. Now that we've covered supply, let's take a look at some of the factors that affect demand. This isn't quite as nuanced, but there's still a lot to cover here. The first is simple popularity of the genre, IP, or console. As stated before, there is massive demand for shooter games and sports games, so they are produced in a quantity to meet that demand. The genres are so prevalent, there is massive amounts of sales data for companies to comb over to get it just right. The games will stay at MSRP for quite a while, and when the demand falls due to the next yearly release being announced, they will be discounted. It's all planned out. It's usually not clearance because of poor sales, at least with these sorts of titles. The two sides of supply and demand stay fairly level through most of the life cycle of the game. On the secondary market, even years later, the titles remain readily available because so many were produced, and they are not considered staples in people's collections because many sell their old copies or trade them when the new, improved game releases a year or two later. Hence, many old shooters and sports games can be found extremely cheap. There can, however, be a flip side to this equation, with games produced in smaller quantities that do not meet the sales expectations for whatever reason. It could be that the game was marketed poorly. It could just be a terrible game. For whatever reason, they will end up clearancing these. Sometimes, these games will not even sell at the reduced price. This leads us to situations like we had with Rule of Rose. Already produced in small quantities, the game faced criticism for both its gameplay and the themes and content in the game. I remember seeing bargain bins filled with copies of Rule of Rose in Kmart. Never even thought twice about grabbing one. These games often get sent back to the publisher and destroyed. It is literally cheaper to dispose of these pieces of plastic than to store them, especially at their greatly reduced value. This is how you get landfills full of ET games. The difference here is years down the line, people suddenly wanted to see what was up with the odd gameplay and troublesome themes of Rule of Rose. Well, by that time, they were all either laying at the bottom of a stack of someone's backlog or long destroyed and written off. That is how you get $700 survival horror games. The most volatile of all factors is the dreaded FOMO. Fear of missing out drives massive movements in the video game market. Things like a popular YouTuber pointing out a hidden gem, or a sudden interest in an IP or genre, like Atelier and Trails when a new game is announced. Even speculation from columnists and content creators over whether games will be reprinted in the future. All of these can have massive effects on the prices on the secondary market. More sinister yet are the scalpers that wait for closures of digital storefronts or bought-purchase limited quantity special editions online and artificially mark up games that were worth little before or greatly exceed the MSRP of those special editions to line their pockets. Their greed, combined with the great fear of missing out on owning these games physically, can produce dramatic results, like we saw recently with many 360 and DS games. Even as a physical collector, I tried my best to avoid these things. It is literally heartbreaking to see. There was no change in supply, physically at least. The same amount of those games still exist out in the world, but now with the faucet of digital availability being turned off, there is simply no other option, and you are at the mercy of those who have bought those games up. When the Wii U and 3DS eShops went down, as much as I wanted many of those games physically, I simply went into Walmart with my head down and bought Nintendo cards to purchase the games I absolutely needed before the shops closed. As much as I wanted to hold those games in my hands, avoiding FOMO was for the best. This is the way. In conclusion, there are so many moving parts in the video game industry, from the production and selling of new games, to the flea markets, pawn shops, and thrift stores selling us old games. There are so many players with different motivations. Some of us, no matter what part of the equation we work within, are in it for the love of games. Some are not, and only care about profiting off those of us who do love the game so much. Companies have to make profitable decisions, or we won't have anyone producing games at all. GameStop has to make a profit off the games they buy from or trade with you, or we won't have any viable way to get used games. This is simply how economics works. We don't have to like it, but we do have to learn how to make informed decisions and operate in this space as collectors and gamers. I hope this little video may have helped you do that. I love video games, and if you watched this, I assume you do too. Let's keep doing that, for as long as they keep making physical games for us to own and cherish. Thank you for watching. Maybe subscribe if you liked the discussion we had here. And as always, stay creepy.